Winter of 1010, in the frozen forests of Norway. Two men trudged desperately through the deep snow, their footsteps leaving tracks that would soon be discovered by their pursuers. One was tall and imposing, maintaining his aristocratic bearing even in flight. This was Håkon Jarl, the powerful pagan ruler of Norway and last defender of the ancient Norse gods. The other was short and dark-skinned, his face marked by the harsh life of a slave. Tormod Kark, the Jarl's personal servant for more than 20 years. Within days, this slave would commit the most shocking act in medieval Norwegian history. He would decapitate his own master while he slept, carry the head as a trophy to his enemies, and receive his own brutal execution as reward. How did a man who had served faithfully for decades transform into Norway's most infamous assassin? To understand Tormod Kark's devastating betrayal, we must return to the bloody times of Nordic conversion to Christianity. Tormod was born around 970, the son of Celtic slaves captured during Viking raids in Ireland. He grew up on the lands of the Treason family, first serving Olaf's father, and later the future king himself when he was still just a young warrior. The relationship between Tormod and Håkon was complex and contradictory. On one hand, Tormod was human property, a slave without rights who could be sold, punished, or killed at his master's whim. On the other, he had served the family for so long that he had almost become a member of it, knowing all their secrets, participating in all military campaigns, and enjoying a trust that few free men possessed. Håkon Jarl was a legendary figure of old pagan Norway. Powerful, cunning, and deeply religious in the ancient Nordic customs, he had governed Norway as viceroy under Denmark for decades, keeping alive the cults of Odin, Thor, and Freyr. He was the last great defender of Nordic paganism against the rising Christian wave sweeping across Scandinavia. Håkon's great enemy was Olaf Tryggvason, the Christian king who had returned from exile, determined to convert all of Norway to the new faith. For years, Håkon resisted the Christian advances, keeping pagan temples functioning and protecting the priests of the old gods. But in 1000, Olaf finally managed to defeat Håkon in battle, forcing the pagan Jarl to flee and hide. Tormod accompanied his master in all these campaigns against the Christians, witnessing the gradual destruction of the pagan world that Håkon defended. As a slave, he had no choice but to obey, but historians suggest that in his heart he remained divided between loyalty to his master and the realization that the pagan cause was lost. Tormod's privileged position as the Jarl's personal servant gave him access to information that few possessed. He knew Håkon's military plans, understood his secret fears, his physical and psychological weaknesses. More importantly, he knew that his master was being hunted by Olaf Tryggvason and his Christian warriors, who offered enormous rewards for his capture. In 1010, Håkon's situation became desperate. Olaf had consolidated his control over Norway, and the pagan Jarl was reduced to hiding in caves and forests like a common fugitive. His former allies had either converted to Christianity or been killed, and with each passing day, the noose around him tightened. For weeks, Tormod helped Håkon hide, bringing food, information about the movements of Christian warriors, and keeping the Jarl's location secret. But the situation was hopeless. Olaf controlled the entire country, offered enormous rewards for information about Håkon, and with each passing day, the chances of escape diminished. It was in this context of desperation that Tormod made the decision that would define his place in Norwegian history. Olaf Tryggvason had offered not just gold, but also freedom and land to whoever brought him the pagan Jarl's head. For a slave who had spent 40 years serving without hope of liberation, it was an irresistible offer. But something deeper motivated Tormod. a rage accumulated over decades of humiliation and submission. Although he was treated better than most slaves, he remained human property, an object that could be discarded at any moment. The forced conversion to Christianity, which he had been obliged to embrace publicly while secretly maintaining his faith in the old gods, was just another humiliation in a life full of them. One December night in 1010, while Håkon slept exhausted in the cave that had been his refuge for weeks, Tormod made a decision that would change everything. Silently, he withdrew his master's sword and positioned himself over the man he had served for more than 20 years. What passed through Tormod's mind in those final moments, we will never know. Perhaps he thought of all the humiliations suffered, of the lost pagan cause he had witnessed crumble, of the freedom he could finally achieve. Or perhaps he simply calculated coldly that Håkon was doomed anyway, and that his death could at least guarantee his servant's survival and freedom. With a single precise blow, Tormod decapitated Håkon Jarl while he slept. The last great defender of Nordic paganism, the man who had ruled Norway for decades, died without even waking, betrayed by the man he trusted most. Tormod wrapped the Jarl's head in cloth, hid the body in the cave, and set off toward Olaf's warriors. Tormod's arrival at Olaf's camp caused a sensation. A Norwegian slave claiming to have Håkon Jarl's head. Initially, the Christian warriors doubted his story, but when Tormod unwrapped his macabre trophy, revealing the unmistakable head of the pagan Jarl, the camp exploded in celebration. Olaf Tryggvason was ecstatic. Finally, he had definitive proof of his greatest enemy's death, the man who had resisted Norway's Christianization for decades. Håkon's head would be displayed publicly to prove to everyone that the last defender of Nordic paganism was dead and that Christian conversion was complete. Tormod was received as a hero by the Christians. He received the promised gold, had his freedom officially granted, and was offered a position in Olaf's army. For a few days, it seemed he had made the right choice. He was free, rich, and respected by powerful men. His life as a slave had ended, replaced by the prospect of a new existence as a free warrior. But the celebration was short-lived. Olaf Tryggvason, although satisfied with Håkon's death, soon began to reflect on the implications of Tormod's betrayal. If a slave could betray and assassinate his master after decades of apparently loyal service, what guarantee was there that he wouldn't do the same to new masters? If he could decapitate a Jarl while he slept, what security did other leaders have? Suspicion grew when Olaf noticed how other slaves and servants in his own camp looked at Tormod. Some with admiration for his courage, others with envy for his reward. But all saw that it was possible for a slave to kill his master and be rewarded for it. This was a dangerous lesson that could not be allowed. 3 days after receiving Tormod as a hero, Olaf Tryggvason made a decision that shocked even his own commanders. He summoned the former slave to a private audience and confronted him with a brutal truth. Although his betrayal had been useful, it was also a dangerous example that could not be tolerated. "You killed your master while he slept," Olaf declared. "If you did this to a man who treated you well for 20 years, what will you do to us when the opportunity arises?" The logic was implacable. A traitor who had betrayed once would inevitably betray again. Tormod had become a victim of his own success. Tormod's execution was scheduled for the following day, but it would not be a quick or honorable death. Olaf decided that the former slave's death would be a public example of what happened to traitors, even those whose betrayals were temporarily useful. The irony was cruel. Tormod would be executed, not despite his successful betrayal, but because of it. On the morning of the execution, Tormod was led to the center of the Christian camp, where a crowd of soldiers and officers gathered to witness his end. The man who 3 days earlier had been celebrated as a hero now walked toward the execution block as a condemned traitor. Historical records differ on the exact details of Tormod's execution, but all agree it was particularly brutal. Some sources claim he was decapitated with the same sword he had used to kill Håkon. Others suggest he was drawn and quartered alive as fitting punishment for a regicide. What we know for certain is that his death was public, violent, and intended to discourage other slaves from trying to follow his example. In his last words, Tormod supposedly showed regret not for having killed Håkon, but for having believed he would be rewarded for it. "I killed a king and die as a slave," he reportedly said before the execution. "The freedom I sought was merely an illusion." The death of Tormod Kark sent a clear message throughout all of Scandinavia. Betrayal, even when useful to the powerful, would not be tolerated or rewarded in the long term. His story became a cautionary tale told for generations, warning about the dangers of trusting traitors and about the futility of seeking freedom through betrayal. Ironically, Håkon Jarl's death at the hands of his slave completed Norway's Christianization, as Olaf had hoped. With the last great defender of Nordic paganism dead, resistance to the new Christian customs collapsed completely. Tormod's betrayal eliminated not just a Jarl, but an entire era of Norwegian history. The story of Tormod Kark also raises profound questions about loyalty, freedom, and justice in medieval society. As a slave, Tormod had no choice about his condition or about serving Håkon. His betrayal can be seen as a desperate act of self-liberation or as pure villainy against a master who treated him well. The answer depends on the perspective of whoever tells the story. From the viewpoint of medieval slaves, Tormod might have been a hero who had the courage to act against his oppressors, even knowing he would probably pay with his life. From the nobility's perspective, he was a terrible example of ingratitude and betrayal that justified keeping slaves under strict control. This duality in interpreting his story reflects the fundamental tensions of medieval society. More than 1,000 years after his death, Tormod Kark remains a fascinating and contradictory figure in Norwegian history. His story has been told and retold by poets, chroniclers, and historians, each version emphasizing different aspects of his personality and motivations. For some, he is the courageous slave who freed himself through violence. For others, he is the cowardly traitor who killed a good man out of greed. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Tormod was a complex man, shaped by decades of slavery and humiliation, who made a desperate decision under extreme circumstances. His betrayal was simultaneously an act of personal liberation and a terrible crime against someone who trusted him. Tormod Kark's legacy transcends his time and geography. His story echoes through the centuries as a reminder that even the closest relationships can be destroyed by fundamental inequality of power. When one person owns another as property, loyalty can never be completely guaranteed, no matter how well the slave is treated. Today, when slavery has been officially abolished throughout the civilized world, Tormod's story serves as a somber reminder of how systemic oppression can corrupt even the most intimate human relationships. His betrayal was not merely personal, it was political, social, and profoundly human. The slave who decapitated his master and was executed for treason left a legacy that transcends his violent death. Tormod Kark became an eternal symbol of the complexity of power relationships, the futility of betrayal as a path to freedom, and the inherent tragedy in societies based on human ownership. His story remains relevant as long as power inequalities exist, and people are willing to do anything to escape oppression.